have Dr. Adams here from the St. Louis Seminary, professor of exegetical theology at the St. Louis Seminary. And we are just thrilled that he was able to come and talk to us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. I was asked to address the topic of teaching creation at Concordia Seminary. Basically, what do we do? I should let you know, just my background briefly, my PhD is in the area of Old Testament, and my doctoral dissertation was in the book of Genesis, but it was in the patriarchal narratives, Abraham and later, not in opening chapters. But nevertheless, the book of Genesis has been my specialty academically. I also have spent a number of years doing archaeology, a number of summers doing archaeology in Syria and in Israel. This has affected the way that I dress. Archaeologists don't dress nicely because, archaeology tends to destroy clothes that you wear. So if you don't know, archaeology is a lot like construction work, except it's in reverse. I always told students, this was like destruction work because we tear things apart, once we're done with them, we don't put them back together again. So, in any case, archaeologists tend to dress a little casually. I hope that's not a problem for anybody. So, teaching creation at Concordia Seminary. What do we want to do here? In the time that I have, I want to address three questions. First, how does teaching creation fit into the curriculum of the seminary? And the reason I want to touch on this point is most people who aren't involved one way or another with seminary education don't really have a good sense of what it is that seminaries do in terms of academic program. And I think it's helpful to, to kind of have a little overview and see where the teaching creation fits into that. The second question I want to answer is, what do we actually teach about creation? And the third question, and maybe I'll spare you this depending on time, but I think we'll have time for it, is as an exegete who has spent many, many years teaching and reading the book of Genesis, and including the first 3 chapters in Hebrew, and teaching it, what do I see when I look at Genesis 1? Because frankly, what I see is probably a little different from what most other people see. And I'll explain why and what that is, hopefully, in just a minute. So, how does creation fit into the structure of theological education at the seminary? Our basic academic degree is the Master of Divinities degree. In its current configuration, that consists of 98 semester hours, with 12 of those being assigned to the year of internship, or vicarage as we call it, which means we really have 86 class hours, semester hours. Of those, 12 are free electives. By the way, I should say we just went through a major revision of our curriculum. We spent part of that, we spent a year or so talking to people in the church to find out what they thought we should do. And the answer we always get from the church when we do that is more. More of this, more of that, whatever it is, it's always more. And we kind of concur with that. The problem is, nobody ever tells us what we can take out. Because of the academic structure, it's a zero-sum game. If you put something in, you have to take something out. So this is the way things are at the moment. In addition, we have a resident field education program and a personal and pastoral formation, what we call labs. These are not academic coursework, but it's things that students have to do as part of their process of formation as pastors. So we have, by the time you take out the electives, there are, my math isn't all that good, 74 semester hours that are controlled by the faculty that we get to do classes of. In those, we have classes in 4 academic areas. There's biblical studies, or exegetical theology as we call it, church history or historical theology. There is the study of doctrine, systematic theology, and then there's practical theology, the development of pastoral skills. I've always thought this division is a little artificial and unfortunate. For one thing, I teach biblical studies. I spend all of my time teaching students how to interpret text. That's a practical skill. So why it isn't in the practical department, I don't know. Furthermore, if one's going to preach a sermon, one has to do some exegesis in order to preach that sermon. So, and the same is true if we're going to talk about doctrine. Doctrine and exegesis interact with one another, and they interact with the practical skill of how you teach them. So I've always felt like this is a little bit of an artificial distinction. It irritates me sometimes. Nevertheless, it's what we have, and we live with it in a fallen world. Nevertheless, when it comes to teaching doctrine of creation is primarily covered in these 2 areas. By exegesis when it comes to studying biblical texts, and in systematics when it comes to the doctrine of creation per se. Since I'm an exegete, I'm going to talk about that area first. In exegesis, or as part of the exegetical program, we teach students biblical languages. That's because God in His wisdom inspired the biblical authors to write in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, not in English or German or French. That's how the Word of God is written. To understand it correctly, frankly, you have to read it. And that's not to say that you can't understand it on a certain level, reading it in translation, assuming the translation is competent. But there's always information that's lost in the process of translation. And frankly, there's information that's added in the process of translation. And so, to work through those things, you kind of really do need to know the languages. In addition, we teach interpretive and literary theory. My class, I think it was last night or this morning, gave us the term hermeneutics. I didn't want to use that term because, as he said, it's not allowed in Scrabble. Is that what he said, Mike? So I decided just to call it interpretive and literary theory, and I should have said methodology as well. That would be hermeneutics. We also teach the history of how the Bible's been interpreted. We teach Bible history and the context in which the books are written, because, as several speakers have emphasized, context matters. And that includes not just literary context, but the context in which the biblical authors were writing. And that includes not just history, what was going on, but also the cultural context. And I'll mention one of the ways that cultural context impacts the study of the creation account in particular in a few minutes. Finally, at some point, we get around to actually teaching the books of the Bible, hopefully. So when it comes to biblical languages, I've already mentioned, every one of our students in the MDiv program is required to take Hebrew and Greek. They can do some of that work before they come to us and get advanced standing credit for it. Otherwise, it's part of their seminary program. I didn't count those hours in the 98. So the 98 assumes that they've come to us with all those languages. So that's kind of additional. We don't teach Aramaic to everybody. We do teach it. We teach it mostly to graduate students. There's not a lot of Aramaic in the Old Testament, even less in the New Testament, but there is some. And it is, since it is God's Word, we need to be able to read it. It's just that we barely have time to do these other things and can't cover everything. I said, people are always asking us to do more, and they never tell us what to take out. The other option, of course, is just to add more years on. Our program is currently typically 4 years, so we could add a 5th or a 6th or a 10th year, and add more. But this is what we have at the moment. So in biblical studies, the basic hermeneutics course is, we call it Interpreting and Communicating the Word. That's a 3-semester-hour course. Then in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, we have 3 half-semester courses, 1.5 credit hours. In the 3 major areas, the Torah, the Psalms, prophets, and Psalms representing the writings. In the New Testament, we also have 3 courses, one Synoptic Gospels, Pauline Epistles, and the Gospel of John. So, in this context, creation is primarily covered in the Torah course. Over the last 19 years, I probably taught half to 2/3 of all the sections of that course. So I'm pretty well qualified to speak to what we do in that. We'll come back to that a little later. In the area of doctrinal studies or systematics, they cover the nature of doctrinal theology, the Lutheran confessional writings. They also cover the teachings of the church, the doctrines of the church, and how Lutheran theology interacts with what other church bodies teach, and also how the church and the world interface with one another. I mention this because most people don't realize the number of things that are covered in the seminary curriculum, the number of topic areas, and it's useful to know that. So their academic program is 4 3-hour courses: Introduction to Systematic Theology, Creeds and Confessions, Systematics 1, Church and World, and then a 1.5-hour Systematics 2 course. The Doctrine of Creation is taught primarily in the Systematics 1 course, and I've never taught any of those. I talked to the instructors who taught those courses to find out what they covered, and I'll share a little bit of that in just a minute. They wanted me to emphasize that they also have 3 electives that deal with the area of creation. One called Studies in Creation, one called God in Creation, and I could never get a clear sense from anybody of what the difference was and why they needed 2 of them. In one, Creation and Salvation in the writings of St. Cyril of Alexandria. The reason we teach that course as an elective is that we have somebody who likes Cyril. Electives by their very nature depend on the individual expertise and interest of the instructors and the students, so you never know what you're going to throw. I didn't mention it, but in biblical studies, we also teach an elective in the book of Genesis. I taught that both at the MDiv level and at the doctoral student level for many years. So that's where creation fits in the courses that we teach and in the academic program that we currently have. So within that, what do we teach about the doctrine of creation? First, I'm going to put this in non-technical language, so I think it will make sense to you. We teach that creation was a unique divine activity. Unique in 2 senses. First, unique because only God does it, and secondly, unique because He only did it one time, so far as we know. If God created other universes, He hasn't told us about them. Earlier, one of the speakers made the point about, if there were, that you have to be connected to Jesus by blood to be saved, and that Klingons couldn't be saved. Which made me think there are 2 solutions to this problem that I've encountered. One was the C.S. Lewis solution, which kind of maintains that the death of Jesus would apply to people anywhere and everywhere. There are beings anywhere and all of creation, and so including Klingons, I suppose. And the other is the Larry Norman solution. Larry Norman was a Christian songwriter from the 60s and 70s. His solution, in the words of the song, was, if there's life on other planets, I'm sure that He must know that He's been there once already and died to save their souls. So his answer was that, if you had to be connected by blood, then Jesus would have, appeared on whatever the Klingon's home planet is, Klingon, as a Klingon and died for their sins. I don't know. Take your choice of any of those three solutions. The Bible doesn't speak to it directly, so I'm not going to. In any case, creation is a unique divine activity. He only did that once, so far as we know. Secondly, God brought the material world into being out of nothing. Creatio ex nihilo, the technical term. I mention this because this becomes important in relation to Genesis 1 in a way that we'll come back to in just a minute. He did this over the course of 6 or 7 natural days. I know Exodus talks about God worked for 6 days. I put 7 in parentheses here because I'd like to emphasize that we sometimes misunderstand what God did on the 7th day. On the 7th day, God didn't just hang out on the beach with an adult beverage, and relax because he was tired. On the 7th day, God created what in Hebrew is called Shabbat, the state of rest. And that state of rest, the Shabbat, it's also the same word used for the Sabbath day, but of course the Sabbath day wasn't initiated to the book of Exodus. But God created Shabbat, and Shabbat is not just doing nothing. Shabbat is the state of creation. It's what God wanted creation to be when he was done with it. So if there had not been a fall, Shabbat would have been what creation, what the state the world would have been in forever without a fall. So God was establishing Shabbat on the 7th day. I just finished writing a book on the presence of God, the theology of the presence of God. I can't tell you when or who's going to publish it yet, but there is a major part of that has to do with the theology of Shabbat. So you can look for that, and point to it and laugh when you see it. I'm not going to say very much more about it here. Creation conformed to God's will. In other words, it was everything that God wanted it to be. Several people have mentioned Tov and Tov Ma'od, good and very good. That's a way of saying that it conformed to what God wanted it to be in every respect. That humankind are made the stewards of God's creation. That rejection of God's will by Adam and Eve, and we teach that they are historical people, led to corruption of the state of Shabbat. By the way, I said 6 days. I didn't mention, we definitively teach that the word day in Genesis 1, when applied to 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and so forth, refers to, we prefer to use the term natural day, because most people don't realize the Old Testament never talks about a 24-hour day, because Hebrew doesn't have a word for hour. It also doesn't have a word for minute or second. Those are really social constructs. We decide how long an hour is going to be. They didn't have those words. They didn't even really have those ideas in the language. So the Bible doesn't use that language as an exegete because the Bible doesn't use that language. I don't use it. I prefer to talk about a natural day. When people ask me about what it means, I said, you tell, it's the way the daily cycle of time was experienced by Moses in roughly 1400 BC. And so far as we know, it hasn't changed between then and now. So if, and actually I'm not an astrophysicist, but I've read on the internet a lot. So I know that the actual cycle of the day isn't 24 hours, and it's not even the same every day. I don't know if you know that. It actually varies over the course of the year, at least according to that source of all human knowledge, Wikipedia. So, in any case, rejection of God's will led to the corruption of Shabbat. And all that we live in after the fall, that rejection of God's will, is characterized by the loss of that state of Shabbat that God intended the world to be. But immediately after that, God initiated a plan to redeem His creation and restore the state of Shabbat that was lost. This becomes the restoration of Shabbat is a critical theological theme for both the Old Testament and the New Testament. You know, when the New Testament says Jesus is himself our peace, you know, the peace is not exactly the Greek equivalent to Shabbat, but it's part of the same group of words that the Old Testament uses to talk about the state of Shabbat. This plan culminated in the incarnation, in the crucifixion and the resurrection of God himself as he was incarnate in Jesus Christ, and it will be completed at his second coming. So the overall emphasis in what we do in teaching creation is on creation as theology. Now, I understand that will be less than satisfactory to some of you who would like us to place more of an emphasis on creation and apologetics. And it's not that we are opposed to that in any way. In our catalog, we don't have an apologetics course at the moment. Now, I was told by the chairman of the systematics department that they actually do teach an elective in apologetics, but then again, he couldn't remember who taught it, you know, and he couldn't lay his hands on a syllabus for it, which, you know, if you know seminary professors, it may not be that unusual. And in any case, it's not in our catalog, so I can't tell you what's covered in that course or how often it's taught even. But apologetics of any form are not part of our core MDiv curriculum. Perhaps they should be. Perhaps that was a lacuna, a hole that was left in our most recent curriculum review. But if it was partially because nobody in the church told us that they thought it was important, which says something maybe about where we are as a church body, but that's another conversation. We emphatically and without hesitation affirm the accuracy of the biblical account of creation in all of its details. I mentioned, you know, Yom, that's a 24-hour day. There's nobody on our faculty who thinks otherwise or teaches otherwise. We've had a lot of discussions in the last year or so in our faculty about this, so I think I can reasonably reflect what, you know, our faculty members have said. So, that in brief summary is what we teach about creation. I'm going to try to finish so that we have some time for questions along the way. So, hope you'll stick with me, and if you have questions, I'll be happy to entertain them. I'd like, before we get to questions, however, to share with you what I, as an exegete who focused a lot of time and energy on reading Genesis 1 to 3, what I see when I read it that may be a little different from what the average reader sees. Which is to say, I'm not as good as an average reader, so my vision is a little out of focus, perhaps. Mike Ritter last night made the very good point that the ultimate measure of teaching is what your students can do. And we're very sensitive to that, and we spent a lot of time in the last few years thinking about what we wanted our students to be able to do. So, when it comes to exegesis, interpreting biblical text, what do we want our students to be able to do? And it's not hard, that is to say, it's not hard to tell you. We want students to be able to interpret biblical text correctly. Now, what it takes to get there, you know, with a student who doesn't have any background at all, for the most part, in Greek or Hebrew or interpretive theory or the history of interpretation or any of those things, you know, that's a bigger challenge. But it's not a challenge to say what it is we want people to do. So what goes into interpreting a biblical text correctly? Well, part is recognizing that there are different kinds of texts. Not all texts are created equal. So in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh, we have narrative prose texts like the book of Genesis and most of the book of Exodus, for example. A very significant part of the Old Testament is poetry. A lot of poetry, obviously people think of the Psalms, but much of the prophets are poetry as well, not to mention books like Proverbs and things like that. There are prophetic oracles, which are themselves a different genre, a different type of literature. There is wisdom literature, which is a kind of literary approach to talking about God and the way He's revealed Himself that was common in the ancient world that's not all that common today. So most people don't have any real exposure to it apart from the Bible. And then there is what is generally called apocalyptic literature or eschatological literature. I'm thinking here of Daniel, perhaps parts of Ezekiel in the Old Testament, and so forth. So, students have to learn how to navigate the issues related to interpreting. It's not just interpreting Hebrew text, but it's interpreting a number of different kinds of Hebrew text. You have to read a historical narrative prose text differently than you read a wisdom literature text. In the New Testament, the matters are simpler. They also have narrative text, the Gospel and Acts, but they have something we don't have really in the Old Testament. Those are what we might think of as argumentative writings. Particularly Paul's epistles fall into that, where much of the literary work is an argument. Paul is trying to persuade them of something. So we don't really have that in the Old Testament, at least not to the same degree, and not very much. And of course, there's apocalyptic eschatological literature in the book of Revelation in the New Testament, and it's different from that of the Old Testament to a degree. In addition, there's one other thing, not a genre, but as it relates to all of these, there's another thing that students have to be aware of, and that's understanding how the New Testament authors are employing text from the Tanakh, from the Old Testament. That's a separate set of issues, because first century early Christian writers basically employed the same interpretive approaches as their Jewish contemporaries. And first century Jewish methods of interpretation are different from the way that you and I would typically read a text. And frankly, that confuses people sometimes when the Gospels or St. Paul will quote texts from different places and put them together in a way that draws a conclusion, and you think, if I go look that text up in Genesis and I look this one up in the Psalms, Paul puts them together and draws a conclusion, but I don't see how that really fits with either one of those locations. Well, Paul's doing an interpretive method common to his day, but not common to the way that we read texts, and that's an issue that students have to learn to navigate as well. In doing all of this, anytime you read any text, any biblical text, it's important to understand there are always two kinds of questions and it's important to be aware of the difference between them. There is the question that the author was attempting to answer. That is to say, Moses wrote Genesis 1, 2, 3, and so forth for a particular reason, to communicate a set of ideas. And those ideas were primarily targeted at the audience of his day. Secondarily, to God's people in all times and all places. But he wrote it in a historical context to a historical and cultural context. And the Holy Spirit inspired him to do that in a particular way. The second, and in some ways more interesting to us, questions are the questions that we would like to have answered. Sometimes we come to the biblical text, and this can be true of any text, not just Genesis 1 to 3, we come to any text with our own set of issues and questions. And they're not necessarily the same ones that the biblical author had in mind. So, in looking at these things, these two may be the same. The question that I approached, the question that Moses or any other biblical author was trying to answer, may be the question that I want to have answered. But they may not be the same. And students always, ask this question in a class. They'll say, I can't think of a good example at the moment, but they'll say something like, what does this text tell us about X? And my immediate answer is, it tells us nothing at all about X. That is to say, it's, Moses didn't write it, excuse Moses, stick with Moses as our author du jour. He didn't write it for that reason. He wasn't trying to answer that question. But but what Moses wrote may help us to answer that question. So it's not that either one of these is wrong. That is to say, they may or may not be the same, but both are legitimate. It's perfectly legitimate to have our own questions that we need answered. We just have to remember that the questions that we would like to have answered are not always the questions that the Holy Spirit was inspiring the biblical author to answer. They may be, but they may not be. Now, of these two, from the perspective of teaching exegesis, of these two, the first of these, the question that the author was attempting to answer, is most important. The reason for that is kind of straightforward, theologically simple. This is why God inspired the author to write. When God inspired the author to write, it was to do this. And frankly, when it comes to students learning to interpret text, this is what they need to learn to do most. Because it's hard. It requires intellectual discipline and a lot of effort. Some students get there better than others. Frankly, occasionally I have my suspicions that there might be a student or two who graduated from either or both, some students maybe graduated from both, but either of our seminaries who never really get there. I don't know. But in any case, the reason that that's the most important question from an exegetical one has to do with the fact that this is what God inspired the author to write. And so for purposes of preaching and teaching the text in the church, our first concern, not our only concern, but our first concern is that students understand the question that the author was attempting to answer and how he answers it in that text. Now, beyond that, there may be information that we can use to answer other questions. That's perfectly legitimate. Students ask those questions all the time in class. I try to answer them, even if they go really beyond or aren't related at all to the question, to the text that we're actually looking at. So that's an important distinction that, again, if you don't do this all the time, probably hasn't occurred to you. I guess the question is, how do we go about determining the question that the author was attempting to answer? Well, we do that by examining the grammar, the syntax, the word choice of the text. We look at the structure of the passage, the literary context, the historical and cultural context, and the theological context. That is to say, how it fits into the unfolding of the whole theology of the Bible. It's not necessarily the case that Moses knew everything that Isaiah knew, or that Isaiah knew everything that Paul knew. God revealed some things through Paul that maybe Moses didn't know. And so we have to keep all that in mind. Now, I want, for the purposes of the time remaining, to focus on the historical and cultural context here. And the reason is, it's something most people aren't sensitive to when they read the creation account of Genesis, and it has a profound effect on how one reads it. The first thing that you need to know is that outside the Bible, there's no such thing as a creation account in the ancient Near East. Now, people talk about creation accounts in the ancient Near East, but they're not really creation accounts in the same sense that the creation account in Genesis is. And the reason for that is that so-called ancient Near Eastern creation accounts are really more about the coming into being of the gods than they are about the coming into being of the world. Now, having said that, I'm going to explain why that's false. It's false because the reality is that the coming into being of the gods and the coming into being of the world, they're really the same thing. in the ancient Near East. But the point is that these accounts are not really about the gods creating the world in the same sense that Genesis 1 thinks of God creating the world. It's about the gods coming into being, and as the gods come into being, the world comes into being at the same time. So the point of all this is that the reason reading Genesis 1, Genesis 2, the creation account in particular, by the way, I hold the view that Genesis 1 and 2 are not parallel creation accounts. Genesis 1 is the creation account. Genesis 2 is actually, if we look at the narratives in particularly the first part of the book of Genesis, they're all structured as literature in the same way. They have a scene setting part of the narrative, and then they have the sort of major what happened part of the narrative, and then the third part of the narrative is kind of showing the results of what happened. So these are all kind of three-part structures. Genesis 2 is really the scene setting part of Genesis 3 and 4. So in reading this, we tend to focus primarily in terms of what the text says, what Genesis 1 says about us, the creation account says about us. But reading it in the context of the ancient Near East, the primary thing is what it says about God. What it says about us is true, but it's not really the main thing in the creation account. So what is this context? What was the context in which Moses was writing? In the ancient Near East, everywhere outside of the Bible, the material world is understood to have been eternal. Now, not the shape of the world that we experience, but the fundamental stuff of the universe, what we might call matter, was thought to be eternal. The gods were themselves material. The gods were part of that fundamental stuff of the cosmos. And that means that the world, as we know it, is divine. So we tend to talk about, say, Yam as the god of the sea. And people, kind of don't necessarily have a clear sense in which they thought of that. Well, the answer to that is the sea that we see, spelled differently, is actually the form in which the god Yam is visible to us. So it's not that the sea is a symbol for Yam. The sea is Yam as he appears within the material world. So everywhere in the ancient Near East outside the Bible, the gods are material, the world is divine. Time is cyclical. We won't bother talking about that now. The ordering of the world happened. The ordering of the world, what we think of as creation for the ancient Near East, is primarily the ordering of the world, comes about by divine procreative activity. The gods in the ancient Near East, at least not until very late, 300 BC, the gods don't speak or think the world into being. The world comes into being as new gods are born. Those parts of the cosmos that are visible those show up. So sexual activity, procreative activity is fundamental to the universe. It's the way that new gods are born and the way that the rest of the universe comes into being. The primary concern then of these so-called creation accounts is not creation, but how one of the gods in particular comes to be the chief god in a place. Now, you may have heard that there's the Mesopotamian creation. There's a Mesopotamian creation account called the Enuma Elish. There are actually multiple versions of the Enuma Elish. The Babylonian version is about how the god Marduk became the prominent deity. The Assyrian version is about how the god Ashur became the prominent deity. It's essentially the same story with a few differences in details, but the primary deity changes. That's because the point is not really about creation. It's about how this god became the primary god worshipped in that particular place. So, to wrap up, the distinctiveness of the biblical creation account highlights how the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, is different from all the other gods. And that's why I said that really the main thing is about what it says about God and not about us. So How is this, just to wrap up in the last 30 seconds here, how is the God of the Bible different? Well, there's only one of him, right? That's obvious to us. He's not part of the material universe. He is not a sexual being, and therefore the world doesn't come into being through his sexual activity. He is not limited in any way. Now this is significant because it's natural for us to think of God, that God could do anything. That's not the way they thought in the ancient world, because the gods couldn't do anything. The gods were bound by, every deity outside the Bible was understood to have been limited. They're limited because they're subject to the fates, and their fates are decreed at their birth, just like the fates of humans are. They're also limited by the conflicting wills of the other gods. So there's no God outside of the Bible. If you went to Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Ugarit, anywhere outside the Bible, they wouldn't have made the claim that any God was all powerful. They're all limited. If we can kind of summarize this up by saying Yahweh is free, and none of the other gods in the ancient world is understood to be free. And so the Old Testament says, God of God, he can do whatever he wants to do. And that's a statement. While it seems normal and natural to us to think that way, it's really unique in the ancient world. So the point of all this is Genesis 1 describes a God who is unlike any of the gods in the ancient Near East. And now this is where kind of everything comes home to roost. Because if the biblical creation account is not true, we have no reason to believe that God is who the Bible says that he is. It's radically different from the way anybody else thought about God. And if it's not true, we have no reason to believe that God is any of those things that I just outlined. And I realize other speakers have kind of made this point, so I'm not going to belabor it. But you can see how the historicity of Genesis 1 to 3 entails more than just the issues related to evolution. They really go to everything about the Bible. There's no part of the Bible that's untouched by the creation account, because everything in the Bible it flows from that God is who the Bible says that he is. Well, anyway, that's an exegetical perspective on Genesis 1, and a little bit about teaching creation at Concordia Seminary, and I apologize for going over. You can take points off. I would do push-ups, but I don't know what time your flight is. It's just going to take a while, measured in thousands of years. I scuba dive. Push-ups are easy underwater. So I'll do mine push-ups underwater.